Before the glow of neon bars and chain pubs, there were places that felt like a second home. Wooden beams, tiled walls, jukeboxes humming, and the comforting clink of pint glasses. These were the pubs of Britain's 60s and 70s. They weren't polished or perfect, but they were alive, full of laughter, smoke, and stories. Families gathered, friends met, strangers became neighbours. And though many are gone, their spirit lingers in memory. Today, we're looking back at 20 lost British pubs from the 60s and 70s that had a charm you'll never find again. Number 20. The Family Room. Pints for Mum, lemonade for us. For many kids growing up in the 60s and 70s, the family room was their first taste of pub life. Tucked away from the main bar, it was a space where children were allowed while their parents enjoyed a quiet pint. The decor was plain, often with formica tables and mismatched chairs, but to a child it felt special, like being part of a grown-up world. Mums sipped baby cham or a sweet sherry. Dads had their bitter, and the children shared bottles of pop with paper straws. A packet of crisps with the little blue salt bag was a treat. Sometimes there was even a meat pie or sandwich if you were lucky. It wasn't noisy like the bar, but you could still hear the faint clink of glasses and laughter through the wall. Families sat together, sharing small moments that became big memories. By the 1980s, changing attitudes and stricter licensing laws meant fewer pubs kept family rooms. Open-plan layouts replaced them, and children were often left at home. But those who grew up in them remember the magic, the warmth, the laughter, the glass of lemonade that somehow tasted better because it came with belonging. Number 19. The student haunt, cheap, cheerful, and chaotic. In every university town during the 60s and 70s, there was a pub that belonged to the students. The beer was cheap, the chairs wobbled, and the jukebox never stopped. Posters for gigs and protests covered the walls, ashtrays overflowed, and the air buzzed with debates about music, politics, and whatever essay was due on Monday. These pubs weren't glamorous. A pint of bitter cost next to nothing, and the food, if you could call it that, was usually a Scotch egg or a packet of peanuts. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the freedom. Here, students could gather away from the lecture halls, away from the watchful eyes of tutors, and find their own voice. Bands on the rise often played their first gigs in these pubs. Friendships were forged, romances began, and more than a few futures were decided over sticky tables and late-night pints. As universities expanded and chain bars moved in, many of these scruffy little haunts disappeared. Rents rose, refurbishment stripped away the grit, and the soul went with it. Still, for those who pass through their doors, the memory lingers. Laughter, cheap beer, and the feeling that the whole world was just beginning. Number 18. The Highway Pub, last stop before the lights. Before motorways carved up the land, the highway pub was a traveller's best friend. Sitting proudly on the edge of an A-road, it was the place you stopped when the headlights grew blurry and the road seemed endless. Drivers pulled in for a pint, a plate of pie and chips, and sometimes just a strong cup of tea before carrying on. Inside, the atmosphere was lively. Truckers, salesmen, and holidaymakers all mixed together under the same low ceiling. Maps were spread across tables, stories swapped about long drives and near misses, and the landlord always seemed to know how to keep everyone moving again with a smile and a hot plate. The car park outside filled with Minis, Austins, and the occasional coach, all cooling in the night air. Number 17. The Pub with a Parrot. Yes, really. Walk into certain pubs in the 60s or 70s and you might have been greeted not by the landlord, but by a parrot, or sometimes a minor bird, or even a particularly cheeky cat. These were the pub mascots, unofficial entertainers who became as much a part of the place as the dartboard or the jukebox. The parrot would sit on a perch behind the bar, squawking at customers, repeating phrases it picked up, and sometimes shocking the unprepared with a swear word or two. Kids loved it. Drunk regulars tried to have full conversations with it, and everyone, in some way, felt the pub was warmer because of it. These animals weren't novelties brought in for show, they were family. Customers slipped them crisps, the landlord gave them scraps, and they became part of the pub's story. Over time, health regulations and changing attitudes put an end to parrots in pubs. The tradition faded and the animals were retired to quieter homes. But those who remember still smile at the thought, because nothing lightened the mood quite like a parrot shouting, "Last orders!" before the bell rang. It was silly, it was surprising, and it was unforgettable. Number 16. The Back Alley Boozer. If you know, you know. Some of the best pubs weren't on the main street at all. They were hidden, tucked down narrow alleys behind a row of shops or next to the canal where the cobblestones were slick with rain. These were the back alley boozers. No glowing signs, no parking lot, just a weathered door and maybe a small lantern swinging above it. If you didn't know it was there, you'd walk right past. Inside, they were often tiny. A few tables, a short bar, a landlord who looked up the second you walked in. Locals claimed the same stools every night. Outsiders were noticed, not unwelcome, but noticed. The air was thick with pipe smoke, the laughter rolled low, and the place felt like it had been there forever. These pubs weren't designed for show, they were for people who wanted a pint, a chat, and nothing more. They survived on loyalty, not on looks. But as redevelopment swept through city centres in the 70s and 80s, many were demolished or turned into shops. What made them special couldn't be rebuilt. Because the magic of the back alley boozer wasn't in its walls, it was in finding it and feeling like you belonged once you did. Number 15. The tap room, straight from the cask. The tap room was where beer was at its purest. No flashy pumps, no fizzy lagers, just a wooden bar, a few stools, and pints pulled straight from the cask. The walls were plain, the floors often bare, and the regulars were there for one reason only: the drink. You didn't need a menu. You didn't even need to ask. The landlord already knew what you wanted the moment you walked through the door. It was the nonsense side of the pub, where conversations were short, laughter was hearty, and the ale was always a little warmer than you expected. A domino game might clatter in the corner, a dog might snooze under the bench, but mostly it was about the pint. Honest, unpretentious, and satisfying. By the late 1970s and into the 80s, many tap rooms disappeared as pubs merged their spaces into one big lounge. Modern refrigeration and keg beers became the norm, leaving the old ways behind. To younger drinkers, the tap room felt old-fashioned. To the old regulars, its loss felt like the end of something sacred. Because the tap room wasn't just where you drank, it was where you belonged. No polish, no frills, just a pint poured right and company to match. Number 14. The music room, live and loud in a low ceiling. Before stadium tours and glossy music venues, there was the pub music room, often no bigger than your Grand's Lounge, but packed to the rafters with sound and soul. In the back of many British pubs during the 60s and 70s, you'd find a tiny stage, sometimes just a carpeted corner, a microphone held together with tape, and a speaker that buzzed when the bass kicked in, and that was all you needed. Local bands, folk singers, and comedians would light up the room. Some were brilliant, others barely made it through the second verse, but no one minded. Pints were raised, tables were pushed back, and voices joined in for the chorus, even when no one knew the words. For young performers, it was a launch pad. For locals, it was the highlight of the week. You didn't need a ticket, just a pint and a good mood. Over time, licensing laws tightened, jukeboxes took over, and many music rooms were shut or turned into dining areas. That raw, live energy faded away. But for those who were there, those nights still echo in off-key harmonies, sticky floors, and the unforgettable magic of music played loud in a room too small to hold it all. Number 13. The smoke room. Thick as the tea, twice as strong. Tucked away from the chatter of the main bar, the smoke room was the quiet corner of many traditional British pubs. It wasn't flashy, just a small room, usually with thick curtains, dark wallpaper, and the scent of tobacco soaked into the walls. This was where older gentlemen sat in silence, nursing a scotch or a pint of mild, reading the paper or quietly discussing matters of great importance, like the weather or who won the 2:30 at Doncaster. The smoke didn't just hang in the air, it became part of the room itself. Pipes, cigars, roll-ups, they all left their mark. There was a hush in the smoke room, a kind of sacred calm. No jukebox, no shouting, just the occasional clink of glass and the turning of a page. By the 1980s and early 90s, smoke rooms were vanishing. Open-plan layouts took over, and later, smoking bans ended the ritual altogether. Today, you'll rarely find that soft, slow silence anywhere in a pub. But for those who knew it, the smoke room was something special, a place where time slowed down, voices were kept low, and your drink always came with a little cloud of peace. Number 12. The Village Inn, everyone's living room. In every British village, there was a pub that felt more like a living room than a business. The Village Inn wasn't about trendy drinks or themed nights. It was about community, familiar faces, hand-drawn beer mats, and conversations that picked up exactly where they left off, even if weeks had passed. You didn't go there to be impressed, you went to belong. Inside, the fireplace always had embers glowing. A border collie might wander through the bar. There'd be photos of local cricket teams on the walls, handwritten signs for the meat raffle, and someone behind the bar who knew if you took your bitter with a top or not. Kids sipped lemonade and chased each other around the stools, while their parents talked crop yields, school plays, or council gossip. The pub was also the post office, the bulletin board, the booking office for the village coach trip. It was the glue holding rural life together. As young people moved to the cities and countryside habits shifted, many village inns slowly disappeared. Some were turned into homes. Some just sat empty. But for those who grew up nearby, it'll always be remembered as more than a pub. It was the heart of home. Number 11. The Tiled Corner Pub, Ale, Smoke and Ceramics. On the corner of so many British streets stood a pub that looked like part of the architecture. Not flashy, but solid. The Tiled Corner Pub was built to last, and it showed. With deep green or burgundy glazed tiles, gold lettering baked into the brick, and frosted windows with the name etched in script, it had a kind of beauty that only got better with time. Inside, the bar was often curved, with polished wood worn smooth by generations of elbows. Smoke curled in the air, voices bounced off the ceramic walls. The bitter was hand-pulled and slightly too warm, just the way the regulars liked it. You'd find dominoes clicking on the table, a dog asleep near the door, and someone arguing gently about politics or last week's match. These pubs didn't try to impress, they just were, rooted in place, like the people who drank there. But as the decades wore on, many were gutted, modernized, or knocked down altogether, victims of changing tastes and rising rents. Today, only a few remain, protected if they're lucky. For those who remember, the tiled corner pub wasn't just where you drank, it was a neighborhood landmark, a local treasure in plain sight. Number 10, the seaside pub. Salt on the rim, sand on the floor. If you ever holidayed by the British seaside in the 60s or 70s, chances are you wandered into a pub with peeling paint, sticky floors, and the faint smell of vinegar and salt in the air. The seaside pub was a world of its own. Flip-flops at the door, kids still wearing their armbands, and grown-ups queuing for a lager top or a cider and black. You could feel the sand crunch under your shoes, and no one minded. Jukeboxes blared out Cliff Richard or the Kinks, while the fruit machine blinked in the corner, swallowing tuppence at a time. Fish and chips, wrapped in newspaper, sat beside half-drunk pints. Families gathered round formica tables, sunburned and smiling. Outside, you could still hear the gulls and slot machines from the arcade down the road. In winter, the locals claimed it back. Fishermen talked weather. Old couples sipped port by the window, and the same dog always curled up under the same stool. By the late 20th century, many seaside pubs were revamped or replaced with wine bars and chain restaurants. Cleaner, yes, but colder. The old ones, they had character, sea breeze in the curtains, and summer memories soaked into every beam. Number 9. The two-room setup, lounge or public. Step into almost any British pub in the 1960s or 70s and you'd be met with a question before you even reached the bar: lounge or public? That's because many pubs were split down the middle, literally, into two distinct rooms. One side was the public bar, plain floors, cheaper pints, louder chatter, darts on the wall, and a no-nonsense crowd. The other was the lounge, carpeted, quieter, sometimes with a radio playing softly and a touch more polish. It wasn't about class, not really. It was about choice. You picked your side depending on your mood, your company, or your budget. A first date went to the lounge. Around with the lads, public bar, no question. The partition gave each room its own rhythm. You could hear laughter from one side and soft conversation from the other. It gave the pub flexibility and character. By the late 80s, most pubs knocked through the wall to make one big open-plan space. It made sense for business, but something was lost. That quiet moment of choosing your door, that slight pause before stepping in. Because sometimes the magic wasn't just in the pint, it was in the room where you drank it. Number 8. The local clubroom, behind the curtain. Not every pint in the 60s and 70s came from a pub with a swinging sign out front. Some of the best drinks were poured in local clubrooms, quiet little spots tucked behind village halls, sports pavilions, or working men's sheds. You had to know it was there. No big entrance, no neon, just a back door, a wooden bar, and a few old chairs waiting. These places weren't licensed in the usual way, so they often ran as private member clubs. You signed in, nodded hello to folks you knew, and grabbed a pint that was probably cheaper than anywhere else. The beer was basic, the snacks were crisps from a cardboard box, and the ashtrays filled up fast. But the laughter, that was always free. You might catch a quiz night, a meat raffle, or just sit back while the old boys argued about football. Nobody dressed up, nobody put on airs. It was local, lived in, and honest. As rules tightened and social clubs declined, many of these backroom boozes vanished. Some were forgotten entirely, but for those lucky enough to have one, it was a hidden treasure. Number 7. The coach and horses, where the pub met the road. Long before motorways sliced through the countryside, pubs like the Coach and Horses sat proudly along Britain's old A roads. Part pub, part inn, part rest stop, they were built for weary travellers, first on horseback, later in Morris minors. You could pull up, stretch your legs, and find a hot meal, a cold pint, and a quiet room upstairs if you needed one. Inside there were timber beams, brass horse tack on the walls, and a big roaring fire that seemed to welcome everyone in. Sunday lunch was a staple: roast beef, mint peas, Yorkshire puddings, all served with a proper pint of bitter. Truck drivers sat next to families. Everyone shared the same warmth. In the 1960s and 70s, these pubs still thrived, holding on to their old-world charm. But once bypasses and service stations arrived, the footfall dried up. Many Coach and Horses pubs were sold off, turned into private homes, or left to crumble behind new developments. But if you ever sat by the hearth with gravy on your plate and road dust on your coat, you'd remember it forever. The Coach and Horses wasn't just a stop, it was a pause that felt like home. Number 6. The jug and bottle. Bring your own jug. In quiet corners of the countryside, before supermarkets and six-packs, there was the jug and bottle. It wasn't just a pub, it was a tradition. Locals would bring their own jugs or bottles from home and have them filled straight from the cask. No labels, no packaging, just a fresh pint to carry home for supper. Some came on foot, others by bicycle, carefully balancing the beer all the way back. The pubs themselves were humble: wooden benches, stone floors, and a fireplace that never seemed to go cold. The landlord knew whose jug was whose. There was a quiet pride in it. This wasn't pub hopping or drinking to excess. It was practical, local, and honest. By the 1970s, tighter licensing laws and the rise of off-licenses changed everything. The ritual of jug-filling faded, and so did many of the small village pubs that offered it. Some became private homes, others were simply boarded up, their signs left to fade in the weather. But to those who lived it, the jug and bottle was more than a refill station. It was a gesture of trust, a moment of community, and a warm ale shared across kitchen tables. Number 5. The Working Men's Club, with a pint was earned. The Working Man's Club wasn't just a pub, it was a proud piece of working-class life. Found in mining towns, mill villages, and city suburbs, these clubs were built by the people, for the people. You paid a small membership, signed the book at the door, and earned your place among friends. Inside, the beer was cheap, the carpet was sticky, and the laughter was loud. During the 60s and 70s, clubs like these were buzzing on a Friday night. Bingo called out in the back, dominoes clattered on the tables, and live acts belted out on tiny stages. Some even hosted big names, comedians, singers, even stars on their way up. But it wasn't about fame, it was about familiarity. Everyone knew someone. Men came in straight from the shift, still in boots. Women met for raffles and gossip. Kids played under the tables until they fell asleep in a court pile. As industries declined and younger generations drifted away, many clubs shut the doors. But those who remember them still smile at the thought. Because at the Working Man's Club, you didn't just drink a pint, you earned it, with sweat, with laughter, and with a sense of belonging. Number 4. The Railway Tavern. End of the line, start of the night. The Railway Tavern wasn't just a pub, it was part of the journey. You'd step off the train, still shaking the cold off your coat, and there it was. Tucked beside small town stations across Britain, these pubs served commuters, day trippers, and railway men alike. The smell of coal still lingered in the air, and inside the bitter flowed freely. You could hear the clink of pint glasses as clearly as the chug of trains outside. During the 1960s and 70s, pubs like this were a lifeline. You'd pop in for one while waiting for your connection, or meet friends there before heading into town. Some served hearty breakfasts for early workers, others kept a hot pie on the bar for regulars coming home. It was unspoken tradition. You stopped in, even if just for a half pint. As the rail system modernized and stations grew quieter, these little taverns slowly disappeared. Some became takeaway shops, others were simply boarded up and forgotten. But to those who remember, the railway tavern was the perfect pit stop. Part pub, part platform, a place where journeys paused, stories were swapped, and the train always felt better after a quick pint and a warm laugh. Number 3. The Snug. Ladies only, please. Once upon a time, before pubs opened up and everyone drank together, there was the Snug. It wasn't a pub itself, but a special little room tucked away in the corner of many traditional British inns. It had frosted glass, a soft bench, and maybe a vase of plastic flowers on the table. This was where the ladies went. Not because they had to, but because, in those days, it was one of the few places they could. Back in the 60s and 70s, walking into the public bar as a woman wasn't always comfortable. But the Snug, it was quiet, private and welcoming. Women would order a baby charm or a sherry through a tiny serving hatch. They'd talk about family, neighbours, and sometimes even football, just with the curtains drawn. The Snug was a relic of another time, one that vanished as Britain modernised and social barriers softened. By the 1980s, most pubs knocked through their rooms, creating open plans and louder crowds. The Snug faded into memory. But those who remember it remember the calm, the soft voices, the shared secrets. The Snug wasn't grand, but it was safe, warm, and just for them. Number 2. The Red Lion. Anywhere, really. The classic on every corner. You couldn't go far in Britain without running into a Red Lion. It was the kind of pub name that seemed to belong everywhere. On the high street, beside the church, down the road from the allotments. And while the name was the same, each one had its own soul. Some had low beams and ancient fireplaces, others had flocked wallpaper and dark trophies behind the bar. In the 1960s and 70s, the Red Lion wasn't just a pub, it was your pub. A place where birthdays were celebrated with pork pies and bitter, where the local football club held court in the back room. Kids would sip lemonade and sneak a crisp or two while the grown-ups talked shop. The landlord usually knew everyone by name, and if he didn't, you weren't from around there. Over time, as breweries merged and chains took over, many of these Red Lions were rebranded, refitted, or closed for good. Some became supermarkets or flats. Others still exist, but feel different, shinier, quieter, less alive. But for those who remember, the old Red Lion wasn't just another pub, it was a place where life happened. Simple, noisy, and full of heart. Number 1. The Horse and Groom, where everybody knew your pint. In the heart of Sheffield, just off a narrow street lined with red brick terraces, stood the Horse and Groom, a pub so familiar it barely needed a sign. Everyone just knew where it was. It wasn't fancy. wooden stools with chipped paint, a dartboard with more holes in the wall than the board, a bar that creaked when you leaned on it, but that was the charm. After work, men from the nearby mills and steelworks would pile in, still in overalls, voices hoarse from the shift. The landlord, always in his apron, knew your name and your drink without asking. A pint of bitter, already pulling it. A cheese and onion crisp slid across the counter with a wink. The jukebox played Tom Jones and Dusty Springfield. The air smelt faintly of smoke and pickled eggs, and you always left feeling better than when you came in. It wasn't just a pub, it was part of the neighborhood's heartbeat. By the late 1980s, it was gone, knocked down for flats. Some say that kind of pub can't come back. Maybe they're right, because places like the Horse and Groom weren't built, they were lived in. The pubs of the 60s and 70s may have faded, but their spirit hasn't. They were more than bricks and beams. They were the heart of communities, the pause between a hard day's work and home, the laughter that carried through smoky rooms and out into the night air. They gave us music, friendships, first dates, and family memories that still bring a smile decades later. Today, many of those pubs are gone, replaced, rebuilt, or simply forgotten. But for those who remember, they live on like old songs you never forget. If any of these pubs brought back a memory, share it below. We'd love to hear your stories. And if you enjoyed this walk through Britain's past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next one. Together, we'll keep these moments alive. One pint, one story, one memory at a time.